Genie and Cuckoo.
Exposure in photography. In the last few videos, we learned a lot about light. Now let's take a break from light and understand exposure in photography. Exposure simply means the amount of light that is collected by your camera. The dictionary definition of the word exposure is the state of being exposed to something. In our case as photographers, that something is light. In photography, the exposure will determine if the image captured is too bright, that is overexposed, or too dark, that is underexposed. Once you press the shutter button to open the camera's aperture, light rays stream in and reaches the camera's sensor. When the camera sensor is overexposed, the image appears all washed out and we get little or no information about those brighter areas in the photo. As a result, the image appears faded, also known as blown out highlights. This simply means the whites in the photo is way too bright. On the other hand, when the camera sensor is exposed to less amount of light, or in other words, when the photo is underexposed, as a result, we get no information about the darkest areas or the shadows of the image. Such images are called crushed shadows. It is therefore said that the right exposure is a balancing act. When you capture a perfectly exposed photo, you capture all highlights and shadows of the photo like a pro. The exposure triangle. There is no one single setting for adjusting the exposure in a camera. It is a combination of 3 different data settings known as the exposure triangle. Those settings are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Aperture. The aperture is the camera opening that controls the amount of light passing through the camera lens to the sensor. So when we adjust the aperture, we decide on how big or small this opening will be. With a wide aperture, the camera lens will allow more light to pass through and reach the sensor. As a result, the image will be bright. On the other hand, when the aperture opening is narrow, this will limit the amount of light that passes through the camera lens. Hence, the image formed would be darker due to low exposure to light. Too much light can lead to overexposed image and too little light can result in underexposed image. The aperture is measured in f-stops, sometimes even referred as f-numbers. The f-number is a measurement of how large or small the aperture opening is. The higher the f-number, the smaller the aperture opening. For example, f22.0. And similarly, the smaller the f-number, the wider the aperture opening. For example, f1.4. And by now, we all know the drill. Smaller the opening, darker the image, and wider the opening, the lighter will be the image. Shutter speed. The camera shutter is like a door that opens to expose the light to the camera sensor. Shutter speed is the amount of time the camera shutter remains open, collecting the light. In other words, it measures the length of the exposure. Exposure and shutter speed are related to each other. The longer the camera shutter is open, it will result in a brighter image. Similarly, the quicker the shutter is opened and closed, the lesser will be the amount of light that will hit the camera sensor. This will result in a darker image. In a low light condition, to get a well-exposed photo, you will have to keep the shutter open for a longer duration. Nighttime photographers leave their camera shutter open for seconds and sometimes even several minutes to get the exposure of the image captured. One must, however, keep in mind that the longer you leave the shutter open, there are higher chances that you will have more motion blur if there's any movement off or in the camera. Faster shutter speed are good to capture fast action. For example, if you're capturing an event and want a candid expression of people talking, you will want a higher shutter speed. Or, if you're photographing something even faster, like sports, you will want to use a faster shutter speed. Photographers who capture fleeting instances of athletes in motion might only have their cameras open for 1,000th of a second to freeze the exact moment. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of seconds. However, in most cameras it appears as a complete number. When it is equal to or longer than 1 second, you will see a quotation mark identifying a second, for example, 1 quotation mark. When it is a fraction of a second, such as 1/250th of a second, you will see a whole number 250. This, however, may vary depending on camera you own. So it is always recommended to read the camera's user manual to understand how the shutter speed works for your camera. ISO. ISO is an indicator of how sensitive your camera sensor is to the light. Low ISO means that the camera sensor is less sensitive to light and hence you need more exposure. Similarly, high ISO means that the camera sensor is more sensitive to light and hence you need to reduce the exposure. One must, however, remember that as you increase the ISO value, this also results in a lot of digital noise in your photograph. So, as a best practice, always keep your ISO as low as possible. You can compensate for the low sensitivity by adjusting other exposure settings like aperture and shutter speed. We will later study aperture, shutter speed and ISO in detail with some practical photography scenarios. But for now, I hope you enjoyed learning about exposure and how to manage the camera setting that influences the exposure in your photo composition. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Your support will help us spread knowledge. Please subscribe to our channel if you love what we do.